Weddings are one of the most important events in life, where love, happiness, and sweet moments are shared. But for a bride, a wedding is not just her own day, but also a performance of family relationships, cultural norms, and sometimes simmering conflicts between generations. And in a small wedding of a bride with bold choices, there appeared a conservative, extremely uncompromising grandmother-in-law with values completely opposite to the bride. It seemed that everything would go peacefully, but just a few seconds after the wedding ended, the bride's grandmother-in-law caused an irreversible wave. "I met your mother. I immediately understood why you are so unusual." That a seemingly harmless sentence, but it was like a slap in the bride's soul right after the wedding took place. And the story did not stop there. Conflicts over beliefs, values, and political views begin to erupt. The bride, who prides herself on her unique personality, tattoos, large earrings, and a completely free-spirited outlook on life, confronts a conservative and closed-off grandmother-in-law. These differences are not just small differences, but a chasm that separates them. Things become even more tense when the wedding, which should have been a beautiful and fulfilling moment, turns into a stage for hidden confrontations. The bride does not hesitate to express her personality in her words, gestures, and even in her speech when she declares, "We believe in science." It is not a declaration against anyone, but an affirmation of her belief in what she believes is right, even though she knows that it may anger her grandmother-in-law. Each word she spoke was a gentle but profound jab at the values her grandmother could not accept. But these were only the first signs of a larger conflict. The story became more complicated when the bride, despite her efforts to keep the wedding simple and unbiased, found herself forced into an uncompromising situation. Her husband's grandmother constantly criticized and made unpleasant comments about her, the wedding, and the way she lived her life. The constant nagging made her feel disrespected, and gradually her resentment began to rise. When the bride said, "We don't believe in gods, but it's a miracle that everything happened so perfectly today," it may not have been a direct attack, but it was a deep rift in her relationship with her husband's grandmother. And when the grandmother could not contain her displeasure, the bride did not hesitate to respond. Just a harsh word, a carefree joke became an arrow that hit her weak point, igniting a war between two opposite worlds. This is not just a story of a wedding. This is a war between two generations, two completely opposite views on life. And it is even more remarkable when the bride and her husband, a person who also has completely different political and cultural views from his family, begin to feel stuck in this situation. She does not want to have to change herself just to please people she cannot understand. But her husband is in the middle, having to choose between his wife and his family. So, can this relationship overcome the indelible differences, or will it lead to the breakdown of not only a wedding but an entire family? Did the bride do the right thing by standing up for her values, or was she too harsh in her dealings with her in-laws? What happens when love is tested by generations that don't understand each other, and can the people involved find a common path? Surely, you won't be able to take your eyes off the next developments in this story, as the confrontation between the bride and her in-laws becomes more and more intense. And maybe, this is a story that you will see yourself in, the inevitable situations when two completely different worlds meet. Read on and decide who is right, who is wrong, and whether this situation can be saved. When we think of family, the first thing that comes to mind is a warm and intimate image, where love and sharing are the foundation. But for many people, family is not always a comfortable place. Hidden conflicts, differences in life views and values can easily turn an important ceremony like a wedding into a place where these conflicts are openly expressed. And today's story is a clear demonstration of how different generations can create conflicts that are not easy to resolve, especially when their values, beliefs, and life views are completely opposite. This story begins with a small, simple, but meaningful wedding. The groom and the bride are not close to their families, but for them, holding a small wedding with only close relatives and friends is more important than anything. The bride, who had a very different lifestyle from most people, had always wanted her wedding to be not only a big day, but also a symbol of freedom, difference, and individuality. However, things were never that simple. This wedding, with a small number of attendees, was attended by people from the older generation, whose values and views on life had been built up over many years, even centuries. Among them, the groom's grandmother, an old, very conservative and rigid woman, was a character that could not be ignored. He came from a completely different world from the bride. She had strong religious and political beliefs and very traditional views on life, things that the bride felt she could not reconcile. But that was not all. The relationship between the bride and her husband's family was not one built on love and understanding. Although the bride tried her best to maintain a happy and harmonious atmosphere during the wedding, the truth was that her husband's family, especially her grandmother, did not accept her in the way she wanted. This became even more evident when her grandmother's words, actions, and reactions throughout the wedding ceremony showed an irreconcilable attitude. The bride is not a person who is easily hurt. She is strong, independent, and proud of her differences. She has a very particular lifestyle with tattoos and large earrings, and she is very proud of it. The bride is not afraid to express her personality, and her wedding is an opportunity for her to assert that. But for the groom's grandmother, those symbols of freedom and individuality are unacceptable. She belongs to a generation where family, religion, and tradition are the most important factors. The earrings, the tattoos, and the bride's way of expressing herself through her clothes, attitude, and words are things she cannot understand, and perhaps she will never want to understand. The groom's grandmother, an older and very conservative woman, has very strong beliefs about traditional values. She is very religious, very conservative politically, and her views on life are completely opposite to those of the bride. She has always held a harsh view of those who do not share her values, and at this wedding she does not hesitate to express her dissatisfaction with what the bride has shown. Her words about the bride, although seemingly gentle, are implicit criticisms, disrespects expressed through gestures and words that are full of hidden meanings. When she says, "When I met your mother, I immediately understood why you are so different," it is not just a harmless remark, but an attack on the character of the bride and her family. The conflicts between the bride and the groom's grandmother do not stop at words, but are also shown through actions. She not only criticizes the bride throughout the wedding ceremony, but also does not hesitate to make clear her views on what the bride has shown on this important day. The bride did not mean to provoke, but her grandmother's actions and words made her unable to sit still. The bride's declaration that "we believe in science" in a wedding setting, although perhaps not an intentional provocation, was a clear affirmation of her beliefs that the groom's grandmother could not accept. And when the grandmother could not contain her reaction, the bride did not hesitate to respond. This is not just a story of a bride and her grandmother-in-law, but a story of conflicts between generations, of different values that cannot be easily reconciled. The differences in beliefs, politics, and lifestyle between the bride and her grandmother-in-law created an invisible wall between them, and it was this wall that made not only the wedding but also the family relationship more difficult than ever. It not only affects those directly involved but also has a profound impact on long-term family relationships. The story between the bride and the groom's grandmother is a clear example of how differences in perspectives, values, and communication styles can turn what should have been a joyful situation into a psychological and emotional battle that is not easily resolved. The bride, a strong and confident person, is proud of her individuality. Her tattoos, large earrings, and bold style of dress are all parts of her that she does not want to hide or change for anyone. However, these very characteristics are the first point of conflict between her and her husband's family, especially the groom's grandmother. She is a very conservative person attached to traditional values, and has very strong views on how people should live. For her, tattoos and piercings were symbols of rebellion, of things that were not good in her eyes. The conflict between the two became clear as soon as the bride and groom began planning their wedding. They decided to have a small ceremony with only close family and friends in attendance, without the participation of those they did not feel close to, including the grandmother. The bride and groom had tense discussions about whether to invite her to the wedding or not, because they both knew that she would not be able to accept what the bride represented. But in the end, they decided to invite her so as not to offend the family, and at the same time hoped that she would try to respect everyone's space and views during the ceremony. When the wedding day arrived, these tensions never disappeared, but on the contrary, they only thickened when the grandmother appeared. After the wedding, when the bride stood with her husband's family, she immediately criticized her publicly, saying, "I met your mother, I immediately understood why you are so different." Her words were not only a comment about the bride, but also a public criticism, making her feel as if her entire life values were being insulted just because of what she chose to do for herself. This statement is a sign of the groom's grandmother's obvious disrespect towards the bride. These words, although seemingly gentle and not too harsh, showed contempt in a very subtle way. She not only criticized the bride, but also dragged her mother into it, creating a tense atmosphere right at the important moment of the wedding. Witnesses all felt indignant and uncomfortable because of this obvious disrespect. Not stopping there, she continued to say other insensitive words throughout the party, making the bride feel not only insulted but also belittled. Statements like, "You need to learn how to treat people older than you," or, "You definitely don't understand this world because you focus too much on appearances and unimportant things," only added to the tension between the two sides. The bride, although not wanting to escalate the situation on the wedding day, could not help but feel angry at her grandmother's attitude. Her grandmother's words not only openly attacked her, but also touched the values she had put all her heart into. She felt like she was standing up against an irreversible force. The things she cherished, such as science, individual freedom, and respect for differences, were blatantly disregarded. The bride tried to stay calm and respect her husband's family, but what her grandmother did made her unable to help but react. When she talked about believing in science and emphasized that, "We do not believe in supernatural things, but only in things that can be proven," her grandmother responded with a snort and an unpleasant expression. This was a crucial moment, because the bride could no longer remain silent in the face of her grandmother's absurdity. She felt like she was being forced to choose between keeping quiet and protecting her own self-respect. The groom, although loving the bride, also felt torn between protecting his spouse and maintaining his relationship with his grandmother, whom he loved and respected. He sensed the tension in the air and understood that his mother, like his grandmother, could not understand what the bride stood for. But he did not want to sever his family ties just because of a conflict on the wedding day. The relationship between the bride and her husband's family had begun to strain as soon as their differences in views became clear. The discussions between the bride and groom about how to handle the situation became increasingly complicated. The bride felt caught between upholding her principles and not wanting to create more conflict in her husband's family. However, she could no longer tolerate the unnecessary insults that her grandmother and her husband's family had inflicted on her. The groom, despite his attempts to calm the situation, eventually realizes that he cannot continue to stand in the middle of this fight without clear support from both sides. He must decide whether to defend the bride and fight the discrimination her family is creating, or to keep the family peace, which may mean ignoring the discomfort the bride is experiencing. One of the most remarkable moments in this story is when the groom decides to talk to his mother about what happened at the wedding. He wants the bride and her grandmother to reconcile and find a way to respect each other. But after hearing his wife's story, he realizes that her grandmother is not only being insensitive but also deliberately insulting her. He begins to realize that he cannot just stand by and hope things will change on their own. Instead, he must stand up and face the reality of the differences between generations and the values that the bride and his family represent. Finally, the groom decides to be clear with his family about the boundaries that he cannot allow them to cross. He insists that if his family wants to maintain a relationship with him, they must accept his bride, what she represents, and respect her the same way they respect him. However, this is a very difficult decision for him, as it may lead to having to sever his relationship with his grandmother, whom he has loved for many years. Family tensions are not only about protecting love, but also about redefining the values and principles of living in a marriage relationship. When families become divisive rather than supportive, it not only affects the individuals but also puts both people in a no-win situation. This story is not just about a bride and her grandmother, but also about invisible conflicts between generations, values, and everything was now like a storm sweeping everything, and the bride was the center of that anger. Everyone around could not believe what had just happened. The whole wedding seemed to freeze for a moment, but then this tension exploded. The looks from the groom's family, the friends who had been laughing and talking before suddenly became silent, and now they were looking at her with indignation, confusion. This was her and his wedding, but now it was no longer hers alone. Everything had been completely taken away by outsiders, unrelated people. This wedding was no longer joy, no longer a grand ceremony to celebrate love, but a mess full of contradictions and divisions. She looked at her husband, the person she thought would be her support, her companion, but now he stood there completely paralyzed. He couldn't say a word, couldn't protect her, couldn't do anything but stand there silently. He just stood there as if everything had nothing to do with him, as if he wasn't the one walking down the aisle with her, not the one she loved and trusted. She couldn't take it anymore. Every word from her grandmother was like a slap in the face. The criticism was endless, as if wanting to destroy everything she had done. Her words, although sarcastic and provocative, couldn't hide the deep malice. Once again, her grandmother added fuel to the fire when she suddenly spoke. "You are selfish. Do you think you have the right to do everything just because my grandson is your lover? You don't deserve this family, you don't deserve us." Every word from her grandmother was like a knife cutting into her heart. Not only was she insulted, but she also felt like she was being pushed into a world she didn't belong to. Everything she did, every effort she put in seemed to be in vain. She had tried to fit in, to love and care for his family, but all she received in return was contempt and disdain. Not only that, her groom, the man she had loved and trusted, was now standing there, not saying a word. He didn't even look at her, not showing any reaction. His silence was not only a lack of care but also a lack of respect. He had chosen his family over his wife, even though she was suffering humiliation in front of everyone. He didn't know that his silence at this moment was a betrayal. Unable to bear it any longer, she straightened up, not letting herself be crushed by guilt or fear of hatred from her grandmother or her husband's family. She stopped and looked into her grandmother's eyes. This time she didn't turn away, didn't bow her head. She stood firm, and in that moment, anger flared up inside her, an uncontrollable rage. "Who do you think you are? Do you think you can say anything to me without consequences?" She gritted her teeth, her voice cold but strong. "I've endured enough. Do you think I'll continue to tolerate this disrespect? Oh, not anymore. I'm not your puppet. I'm not someone who will bow down to your disgust." She paused, took a deep breath, but her anger did not subside. She looked around the room, and at that moment, everyone couldn't help but notice the change in her. The bride, who had always been gentle and humble, had now transformed into a completely different person. Someone who couldn't bear to be looked down upon by others for another moment. All eyes were on her, and although she could feel the resentment in her grandmother's eyes, in the eyes of everyone around her, she couldn't care less about it. She would not remain silent. And at that moment, when her grandmother smirked, she understood that her efforts had been in vain. To her, she was nothing but a cheap thing, not worthy of respect. But she no longer needed her grandmother's respect, and she was ready to stand up and defend herself. "What are you standing there for? Do you know who I am? I am your wife. You say you love me, but when I needed you the most, you stood there and kept silent. You didn't protect me, you didn't stand up for me, and now you're just standing there watching how things play out. Don't think I'll continue to put up with this disrespect for any reason." And that was when she decided. She could not and did not want to continue this wedding. She could not continue with a man who, on their big day, could not stand up to protect her, could not protect her love from the insults of his family. She turned her back, leaving everything behind. She walked away not because of weakness but because of her self-respect. She understood that if she could not protect herself now, no one would do it for her. She could not and did not want to continue living in disrespect, in a relationship without true protection and love. This wedding was no more. This love was no more. And now she resolutely gave up everything to find the freedom and respect she deserved. She stopped, looked at her family, looked at the people she had trusted, and said her final words, "Good luck with your family, but I will not be a part of it anymore." She walked out of the aisle, and it was the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a new life. A life no longer imprisoned by prejudice and contempt. The wedding, a day that should have been filled with love and happiness, turned into an uncompromising struggle between irreconcilable differences. The bride, at this important moment in her life, not only had to face opposition from her husband's family, but also her own values, the beliefs that she had worked so hard to build over the years. Her grandmother's words, though gentle in form, were as sharp as a knife cutting into her heart. Just one seemingly harmless sentence, but contained so much disdain and discrimination, making her feel that the respect and love she desired on the most important day of her life could not be obtained. The conflict between the bride and her husband's family was not simply a difference in opinion, but deeper than that, it was a clash of opposing values. The bride is a free-spirited person who loves freedom and respects diversity in society, while her husband's family, with its conservative and old-fashioned views, cannot accept that difference. In fact, the expectations from her husband's family, from the person to whom she has devoted her whole heart, have become an inescapable burden. Those expectations not only impose themselves on her but also force her to choose between her family and herself, between love and self-respect. Her husband, although loving, remained silent at the decisive moment. That silence, although it was meant to protect, made her feel abandoned in her own life. Love, with all its romance, cannot exist without protection and respect. That silence made the bride feel isolated in her own home, between a husband who she thought would always be a solid support. In the end, the wedding ended not with happy smiles, but with a deep awakening. She realized that not all relationships can last, not all family members can accept you for who you are. It was a strong awakening, a realization that loving yourself is the most important thing. To do that, sometimes you have to give up things that don't suit you, even the most beloved ones. We cannot change others, but we have the right to choose how to face the world. That is the choice the bride made, giving up harmful relationships to protect herself, to live true to her identity, even if she has to face loneliness and pain. Although it was difficult, the bride understood that happiness does not come from the acceptance of others but from self-acceptance and self-love. That is the most important lesson she learned on this journey. And perhaps that is also a message for all of us. Sometimes to find peace in life we have to learn to let go of things that do not belong to us. It is not defeat or giving up, but the determination to protect ourselves, to live a full and happy life in honesty with ourselves. This story is not just an event in the life of the bride and her husband's family, but a confrontation between two completely opposite worlds. On one side are conservative, traditional values, where everything must follow rigid standards. On the other side is a world of freedom, diversity, and respect for individuals. The bride, in this story, is not only the one who has to face discrimination from her husband's family, but also the one who is fighting to protect her beliefs and values. Right from the first moments of the wedding, a disrespectful act from the grandmother changed the whole atmosphere of the wedding. Her words about her mother, although said with a gentle appearance, contained a clear irony. This story is a clear example of how disrespect, although not said directly, can create a big rift in a relationship. We all know that a wedding is not only a union of two individuals but also a meeting of two families, two cultures, two perspectives on life. And when the husband's family cannot respect what the bride believes and chooses, this wedding is no longer a happy moment. The grandmother's comments, the criticism of the bride's wedding and lifestyle are not only disrespectful to her but also a rejection, not accepting the change in the world around her. Surely, everyone will wonder, should the bride forgive the rudeness of the husband's family? Or can the difference in values between the two be reconciled? Are love and marriage strong enough to overcome these disagreements? The bride decided not to join the dinner with the husband's family and set clear boundaries about what she can accept. This is not cruelty but protecting herself and her beliefs. Put yourself in the bride's shoes. Do you feel she did the right thing? You may feel that she was too strong, but is silence and compromise the best way to maintain peace in the family? Or is standing up for yourself sometimes the only way to avoid losing yourself in a conflict-filled marriage? For the husband, this story is also a difficult challenge. He loves his wife, but family is always an important part of his life. Although he wants to stand on the bride's side, he cannot help but hesitate when facing his grandmother, the person he once loved and respected. He also does not want his wife to judge him as weak, but how can he please both his wife and family without sacrificing either of them? Can he stand firm and protect his wife from these harsh criticisms? This is a difficult question not only in love but also in life. Sometimes the differences between two worlds are too great to reconcile. And then the question is, are you willing to give up important things to maintain your relationship with your loved one, or will you protect the values you believe in despite the loneliness and hardship? Truly, this story will make you think. Are we strong enough to protect ourselves and the people we love, or will we collapse before the imposition of society and family? Can these differences be smoothed over with love and forgiveness, or will they create irreparable cracks? Leave your comments below this video. What do you think about how the bride and her husband faced this challenge? Do you think there is anything that can be done to ease the tension in this situation? Please share your thoughts and opinions, as this is definitely a story that will make each of us reflect on our values, love, and differences in society. This story is not just about a wedding but about the conflicts, choices, and the price we have to pay when we stand firm on our values and beliefs. Will you choose love or will you choose freedom and integrity? Let's discuss.